everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the ANA eLearning Academy. We're very excited for this new opportunity to come together at a time when we're all so far apart. I'd like to give a special thank you to our presenter that's put in many hours to make this happen in such a short time. As you may have seen, we have added many new e-learning opportunities to our website. If you have not checked out our website in the last few weeks, I recommend jumping on to see the other new presentations we've added. I'll share a link at the end of this presentation, but for the record, money.org. During this presentation, you may come up with questions. If you do, please use the chat or Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send in your question, as all of you are muted on this presentation. Your question will come to me, Sam Gelberd, not Brianna Victor, and I will then share the questions with the presenter either in the middle of the presentation after about the 1 hour mark. Our presenter will take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll have some questions. And then at the end, we'll answer some more questions as well. However, the presenter would like to handle the questions. If at the end of the presentation we're able to get or unable to get to all of the questions, we'll send them to the presenter to answer, and we'll get them to email the answer to you. Toward the end of the presentation, I'll send out a survey using the poll feature here in Zoom. Please answer each question honestly so that we can improve our presentations. The surveys will be shared anonymously with the presenter so he too can improve if needed. Joe's pretty good though. So now I'd like to introduce you to the presenter for the day, Joseph Boling. Joseph will be presenting an introduction to paper money production and counterfeit detection. Enjoy. Take it away, Joe, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, everybody, or morning if you're still out on the West Coast. I'm Joseph Boling. I'm a 46-year member of the ANA, a 50-year member of the International Banknote Society, and a 55-year collector of world paper money. I've specialized in a lot of things along the way, but now my specialty is counterfeit paper, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how can you distinguish a genuine note from a fake note, and a little bit about how counterfeiters work, why they work, and at the end we'll also be talking about how they evade security features. But we're probably not going to get through all of that. This is only a 2-hour presentation out of a 4.5-day seminar that we run every other year at the ANA. So if you like what you're seeing here today, come back and take the full seminar. All right, let's kick off here. This is a page from a stamp collector's book. You can see here at the bottom where I pulled this from, Practical Philately by R.J. Sutton. I have no idea when this thing was published, but this is a very useful page because it talks about the various printing technologies that are used for security printing. The oldest secure printing technique is intaglio printing, and it's still used today for virtually all security printing, has at least some intaglio on it. Not all low value notes have intaglio because it's more expensive than lithography, but intaglio is the first principles security feature upon which all other security features are layered. So with intaglio, back in the old days, you had a copper plate. Nowadays, you have a steel plate, and in this plate are inscribed lines which represent features, pictorial and letters, into the steel. The ink is placed across the entire surface of the plate. It goes into the grooves and then is wiped off of the high points, which are not going to print. The wiping, there are various ways of doing wiping. I'll show you one shortly. The old-fashioned way, which is with cheesecloth and your hand. The wiping that's being done today on the high-speed presses is with high-pressure water being sluiced across the surface of this plate and washing the ink away from the areas that are not going to print. Here's the paper. The paper is pressed against the plate under high pressure. The ink comes up out of the grooves and is deposited on the paper. Here's a blow up of one of these elements where the ink is deposited on the paper. And the pressure of applying that paper against the plate actually presses in the paper from the back side. So you get what the auction catalogers all like to call embossing, high embossing. You can actually see, if you illuminate the note with cross light, or you can feel in some cases with your fingers, the embossing of the paper into the designs in the plate. And at high magnification, you get a surface that looks like this. It's very irregular because this is very sticky ink and it doesn't like to come out of this plate, so it gives you a texture on its surface. All right, the next most used, and actually used a lot in emergency situations, is lithography. Originally, it was done on limestone plates. I mean, we talk about a plate, but this was a huge chunk of limestone weighing many pounds that was smoothed and chemically treated so that ink would adhere in some spots and not adhere in the spots that you didn't want to print. Nowadays, these plates are metallic, but they're still chemically treated, and the ink will adhere to the design and not adhere to the open areas. It's perfectly flat. When you press the paper against the plate, the ink comes off the plate onto the paper, but you don't get any embossing because there's no indentation over here for the paper to be pushed into. And you get a much more uniform texture on the printed element. Letterpress is the oldest form of printing. This was the form that Gutenberg used, and the form that Ben Franklin used. Think rubber stamp. This would be your rubber stamp over here, and the elements you want to print are raised off of the surface of the printing element. When you ink, you roll a roller of ink, or in the case of Benjamin Franklin's time, a pad, a leather pad that was pressed against an ink surface and then transferred over to the type, with the ink being transferred to the high areas of the type. You put the paper down on that and you apply pressure, and the ink is transferred to the paper, and you can see here that ink gets actually pushed out along the edges of the printed element. That's one of the diagnostic features of letterpress printing, is the little halos that you get around the printed element. And it gives you a very uniform texture here. And actually, this illustration doesn't show the halos that appear, but you'll see them in a few minutes that are on a real note. And in this case, the pressure is coming from the other direction, and the plate can emboss the paper to the rear. So the design shows up on the back of the note as a raised feature rather than an indented feature. And we're not going to talk about this last one, photogravure, because it's very rarely used for security printing of paper money. It's often used for stamps. Still used today for stamps. All right, here's a German note from the 1930s. This is Herr von Siemens over here, the same guy that the Siemens Electric Company is named for, Werner von Siemens. Law of 1924, issued starting in 1929, and this is an intaglio note. And we're going to be looking at the lapel here, the detail of the lapel. Here's what that detail looks like on intaglio. This is illuminated from the upper left corner. The light is coming down from the upper left, and you can see that it's illuminating the faces of these ridges, and the backs of the ridges are in shadow. You can actually feel this ink standing up on the surface of the paper. This is from an intaglio plate. The ink was down in the grooves on the plate and is now standing on the paper and dried. You can run a fingernail across these ridges and go bump, bump, bump. And with cross lighting, it's very easy to see these raised ink areas. Now, in the late 30s, I'm not sure what, I don't remember what year right now, the Germans switched to a cheaper form of printing. Intaglio is fairly expensive. You get more throughput and less cost if you use lithography. And they changed these notes to lithograph notes. So this is what that note looks like when it's lithographed. You don't get any ridges. It's all perfectly flat on the paper. Sure, this ink does stand up a little bit off the paper. As I said, with lithography, you don't get any embossing either direction, so it's not pushed into the paper, but it doesn't give you at all the same tactile sensation. You can't run a fingernail across this and feel any bumps. It feels very smooth to the touch. And this actually happened before the watermarks were changed in this note. The English language catalogs do not catalog this intermediate stage of switching from intaglio to lithography before the watermarks were changed. Even a few years later, the watermarks were changed, and that is picked up in the English language catalogs, but you have to go to a German catalog to get this intermediate stage. So there's the difference between intaglio and lithography at 20 power. Now let's look at another form of lithography. This is line lithography. This is a British Armed Forces special voucher. It's the equivalent of military payment certificates for British forces. And it's 100% lithographed except for the serial numbers. The serial numbers use a different technology, letterpress, because you can't get running numbers if these are in the lithographic plate. If these were in the plate that the note was printed from, they'd be fixed and would not be changing. So to get running numbers, you have to use a different kind of printing machine, and it uses letterpress. Now in this note, we have two kinds of lithography. We've got single color, this maroon out here on the edges and the main plate here. And then there's this tint underneath. The green, which changes to violet, which then turns back to green. That's a progressive tint. There's a progressive tint on both the face and the back of this note. Now, in lithography, every individual color has to have its own plate unless it is a progressive color, in which case a single plate prints this entire tint from right to left, and the ink is selectively applied to the plate, so you get the violet in the middle and you get the green out here, and it runs together, merges here in a transition zone. You can see it's actually changing from green to violet as we go across here. With intaglio, of course, every color also has to have its own color of ink and its own plate. With the lithography, the line lithography, here's the back of the note, and the progressive tint here goes from gray-green to this yellow to gray-green over here. And you actually don't see the transition zones because the transition zones are buried underneath this maroon color that's the main plate. Now here's what it looks like at 20 power. You can see that each color is individually printed, one on top of the other. There's a spot on the back, which is actually at the transition on the back, coming from the, where'd my cursor go? Coming from the gray-green over into the yellow over here. Now here's the other method of printing color. This is what's called 4-color process lithography, and that's what's used on all your slick paper magazines This is a piece of a tourist magazine from Colorado Springs, cut out and used as a training aid. If you were doing this live in person, you'd have a 20-power microscope in front of you, and you'd be looking at all these kinds of things under the microscope. This is what the color looks like in the 4-color process. We're looking at this spot right here, where this leg and the guitar, or the bass, are next to each other and coming down to the blue. And you can see that the colors are all applied with respect to the density that you want in that particular area. The 4 colors are the same 4 colors you get on an inkjet printer or a laser printer, which are the red, yellow, blue, and black. And depending on what shade you want, the plate prints a color to create that shade or omits one. Over here, for instance, there is no black and there's no blue over here. All we have is red and yellow, and the red and yellow makes the shade that bass fiddle was colored. And over here we have a transition zone, or shadow, and then over here the trousers of the bass player, which have all 4 colors in them. You can see the red and the yellow and the blue and an occasional black. You get more black over here where the shadow is. Down here, you have the blue with a tiny bit of red and a lot of black, because that's a dark blue. That gives it the dark shade that we had over here. Instead of being a bright blue, it's a dull blue. And somewhere else on that picture, and I haven't figured out exactly where this comes from, we have more colors, and you can actually now see the octagonal designs, which are characteristic of 4-color process. If all 4 colors are present, they form these octagons because they're distributed around, so they're not printing on top of each other, they're printing next to each other. You got the blue and the red and the yellow and the black all printing in separate places, but if they're all printing at once, whatever this shade is over here, I don't recall what shade that is on the big picture, all of them are being printed. If you see something like that on a banknote, you're not looking at an original note with all likelihood. There are a few places where 4-color process litho was used for banknotes, but they're very rare. Now let's look at the serial numbers on this note. The serial numbers are printed by letterpress. And what did I say was one of the characteristics of letterpress? You get these ridges around the edges of the printed elements. These halos around the outer edges. Now this is sort of delicate. If this is heavily printed, if there's a lot of pressure applied, then you get the ridges. If it just kisses the paper, you get ink transferred, but you don't get the ridges, but then you're likely to have some dropouts. Now this was set up with high pressure, so there are no dropouts. But in a few minutes, you'll be looking at another letterpress element that had a lot of dropouts. Now the open space here, remember this was line lithography behind, so we had the lithograph, and where there's no ink being applied, everything is perfectly open. This next picture is from a color copier in the A&A library. And you can see a hint of parallel lines here, scanning lines. You don't see any kind of buildup along the edges. In fact, it falls off the edges. It fades out at the edges. And you get all this garbage in here in the fields. What's this all about? Well, color copiers don't like empty space. They put things into empty space. You don't see it with the naked eye. You don't notice those things. You'd have to get up real close to this note to even have a hint that there was something in those open spaces. But if you're looking at a note at the high magnification, and you see these kinds of speckles out in an area that ought to be open, your antenna should go way up, because that's not normal with security printing. Now here's a different inkjet printer, a different color copier, also in the ANA library. They had 2 color copiers in there that year, and I made these copies on each one. And here you can really see the scan lines. The scan lines are very obvious here, and there are even more speckles than on the previous printer. So these 2 printers both behave slightly differently in the way that they create these color images. Now here we go back to letterpress. This is the part of a serial number on a US note, and I don't remember what denomination note this was, but this is the font that the Bureau uses. And you can see the lines out on the edges of the printed element. Here we have a Xerox copy, a laser copy of a serial number off of a counterfeit US note. Now, what is laser? It's finely divided powdered plastic in 4 colors, the same 4 colors that we've already talked about: red, blue, yellow, and black. The powder sticks to the paper electrostatically. There's using a photographic technique or an electrical technique. A charge is placed on the paper where the image is going to go. The powder is applied across the paper. It sticks to the electrostatic charge and actually builds up. It mounds up. It rises above the surface of the paper. This is illuminated from the lower right. And you can see the light coming from the lower right is illuminating the mound on the bottom edge here. And this part up here is in shadow. So this is just like intaglio. And a laser printed element can look like intaglio, can feel like intaglio. You can actually feel, you rub your finger across something which was printed on a laser printer, you can feel the texture of this mounded up toner. Now, what we have here is a bunch of toner which escaped. You know, toner that didn't stay where it was supposed to and went out around the edges. There are only 2 colors being used right here, blue and yellow, because that's what you use to make green. There's might be a little bit of black scattered through here, but you don't see very much, and certainly no red. But you do see some yellow escapees and some blue escapees. Now here's the exact same element photographed under different lighting conditions. The light here is uniform instead of coming from one side. And you can see the blue escapees even better, and the yellow ones even better. Yellow spots out here where you don't want to have them. Of course, the yellow ones disappear on the white paper. The blue ones are more likely to be visible, but as long as they're fairly inconspicuous, remember we're looking at very high magnification here, they're not terribly noticeable. Now here's the Treasury seal on a US note, and you can see that it shows the buildup of ink along the edges of the printed element. This black is intaglio. The black intaglio has what's called feathering on it. When we get to showing you actual intaglio printing, which will be very shortly, you see that, I talked about it, that the ink is applied to the entire plate and then wiped off the parts you don't want to print. Well, the wiping process these days on high-speed presses is done with water, the high-pressure water. And that water doesn't do a real clean job of removing the ink right up to the edge of the engraved element. So you get some ink pulled out of the engraved element and left on the surface of the plate, and gives you that feathering. Feathering is characteristic of modern high-speed intaglio presses, and that's what the Secret Service looks for as a diagnostic of an intaglio, one diagnostic of an intaglio printed note. Because with lithography, you don't get that kind of feathering on the edges of the straight or curved edges. Well, there's a laser copy of a treasury seal on a counterfeit note. You don't see any lines out on the edges. You do see the escaping particles that don't belong there. And what is this business here? Well, what did I say that the laser image was? It's plastic applied to the paper. When you put that toner on the paper and it sticks to the paper, before it comes out of the printer, it goes through a little oven. It goes through a fuser. And the fuser melts all the little plastic particles and forms hard plastic. If you then circulate that note and bend it, that plastic breaks and falls away. And you end up with these kinds of lines. Here's a laser counterfeit. This is a very heavily circulated counterfeit note. Now look at this line across the corner here, and the other line across the corner up here. If we flip it over to the back side, there's that line coming in from the corner here, and the line across the corner up here. Every time this note got folded, that plastic broke and fell away. And here, large portions of it are broken and fallen away. Actually, no, that's part of design. It's not as bad as it looks. Up here it is. It's certainly damaged up here. Now here's a different laser printer, a very well calibrated laser printer. You don't see any escapees around the edges here, but you do see something else that's a little peculiar. You see all these flat spots on the surface. Where are those from? Well, when this thing was in the printer and went through the fuser, that plastic was melted. What used to be a flour textured plastic beads were all melted together and were still soft when this thing went over a metal roller. It went through a roller on the way out of the printer, and the roller mashed down the high spots of the laser mound, of the toner mound, which was still soft. And you got this kind of texture. That can be really deceptive. You have to really have looked at some of these things and understood the process to separate that from an intaglio ink image. We also have some of these funny little yellow spots out here. See these yellow dots? Those are not escapees. Those are intentional. There's one down here, one over here. All commercial 4-color printers these days create those little yellow dots in a specific pattern on every printer. And the law enforcement folks can look at this thing, isolate these yellow dots, and identify that printer right down to its serial number. And then they go to the manufacturer's record and see who was the first OEM purchaser of this printer. So if you buy a new printer and use it to create counterfeit notes, they'll find you based on these patterns on these created on these printers by the serial number of your printer. If you're going to print counterfeits, buy used printers. There's another laser printer using a different technology for creating its images. You can see that this is glistening back at you. That's hard plastic, and hard plastic will reflect light back at you. Inkjet never will reflect light back at you. Inkjet is a fluid ink which soaks right into the paper and never creates a reflective surface. So if you've got a suspect note and you think it might be a laser note, hold it up to a light at a very shallow angle and see if you can get light reflecting off the surface at you. You can get a little bit of reflection off of an intaglio note, but not nearly as much as you get off of a laser note. And of course, there are elements on the laser note which should not be reflecting at all because they're lithographed, they're offset lithography. And if you see them reflecting at you, then again, your antenna should go up. Here's a different spot on that same note, and you can see that it's using the same patterning that 4-color process lithography uses. This is a laser printer. Not all laser printers use this technique for creating the different shades of colors, but this particular one is. So it looks a lot like 4-color process at 20 power. Now here's the last, actually next to last form of printing we're going to talk about. This is something called thermography. If you go on to Google and look up thermography, you're going to find all kinds of stuff about medical imaging of internal organs. For some reason, I've never been able to find lithography as a printing method anytime I've done a Google search. Maybe these days they finally caught up with it, but this is fake intaglio. What happened here was the ink is printed by letterpress, and while the ink is wet, this document, this was a calling card, was run through a bath of finely divided plastic spheres, very, very small plastic spheres, which stick to the wet ink. And then it goes through a fuser, and that plastic is melted, and it leaves, you know, melted, now hardened plastic on top of all the printed elements. Some of it escapes around the edges, but because it's transparent, it's invisible, and it feels to the touch as if it's intaglio. So this is poor man's intaglio. It's what's used almost exclusively these days for pseudo intaglio calling cards and letterheads. Okay, I'm going to switch slide sets now and find one that deals with, well, it's hard to see what's going on here. Here we go. Silkscreen. Silkscreen is a very old technology. It used to use silk as an element to take an image and allow ink to pass through some of the screen and not through other parts of the screen, and therefore create an image on the other side of the screen. These days, silkscreen is used most often for printing sweatshirts. All these sweatshirts that you see that have text on them and fancy designs and what have you are printed by silkscreen, and there are silkscreen shirt presses that turn out scores of these things an hour. I mean, it's fantastic. The number of shirts can be run through one of these machines and be printed. At high magnification, this is the part of the screen which is going to pass the ink, and this is the part of the screen which is not going to pass the ink. And you'll get a pattern on the other side of the screen wherever it's open. You run a squeegee through. Now, this is back to our intaglio. Remember we said that intaglio leaves you with a high surface. Well, the same thing happens with silkscreen. You get a high surface. There's the lithographed. Now here we have an Indonesian note that's printed with all lithography. This is the genuine note. You got 3 colors here. You've got dark brown, you've got pale brown or tan, and you've got light blue. These are all lithographed, and they're all perfectly smooth on the surface of this paper. Now here's one counterfeit. This is still letterpress over here, but it's not very good letterpress. And you can see that there's a lot of dropouts. There's also a lot of slop. You got ink places where it's not supposed to be, but a lot of dropouts. Right up here in this corner is just about the only place in this image that you can see a line out on an edge distinguishing letterpress. There is some buildup along this top edge here, but it's not as sharp as if it had been very high pressure. But the other two colors here are silkscreen. You can see that they're leaving mounds of ink on top of the paper. It's pretty uniform across. You frequently, like down here, you've got more at this edge and more at this edge. The silkscreen process, as the squeegee pushes the ink through the screen, tends to build it up on both edges. But with the amount that you have in here, you can see that this is not letterpress. There's really a lot of ink being deposited on this paper. And the blue went on after the brown. The blue went on over the brown. Now here's a second counterfeit of the same note. Much better letterpress. It's much cleaner. You do have more distinct, more discernible lines around the edges. And in this case, the yellow went on over the blue. The yellow went on top of the blue. And you can see again that there's a lot of ink being deposited on this paper. Now here's an overprint on a French Somaliland note during World War II. The overprint is letterpress. It's being photographed through a slab here, so it's looking sort of washed out, but we do have some discernible buildup along the edges, not a lot. It's just pretty good letterpress. This was counterfeited using Silkscreen. The overprint, adding the overprint to the note adds hundreds of dollars to the value of the note. And here we have a Silkscreen overprint on one of these notes. Now this is being illuminated directly from the side, from the, I don't remember if it's the right side or the left side. Looks like it's from the right side. And you can see screen lines, you can see parallel lines here in the ink representing that screen. Now we have the same note photographed with light now coming from top to bottom or bottom to top. And now you can see the screen lines going the other direction. You can detect the screen lines going both ways depending on where your light is coming from. And look at how built up this is. I mean, this is really thick above the surface of the paper. Not at all like letterpress should look. The fellow who discovered this is back in the 60s or early 70s, wrote it up in the numismatic press at the time that he thought that maybe the plates that had been used during the war had been recovered by somebody, because he said the overprint looked very good. Well, they obviously never looked at it at 20 power, because at 20 power he would have seen the difference immediately, that the way this ink is deposited on the counterfeit is not at all the way the ink is deposited on the genuine note. Okay, now we're going to go to, I believe we're going to intaglio printing. Yes, let me find that set of slides. All right.
Hey, Joe, real quick, just wanted to say something. Phil Vitale shared that he said if Joe would have his presentation in slideshow mode, the participants would see the slide across the full screen. So just something I wanted to put out there. I'm not sure if that's something you're able to do, because I know you have to enlarge the photos. Just something I wanted to let you know, someone had mentioned.
Well, if I do that, it distorts the proportions.
Okay, that's all right.
It makes it look fatter across the middle than it ought to. So
okay,
I don't like to do that.
Understood. All right, just wanted to let you know. All right, Joe. Sorry. You may continue. Sorry, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, here's an intermediate plate for a $20 note. This is the bottom row of a 32 subject plate. And you can see that this plate reads correctly. It doesn't read in mirror image. This is not a printing plate. This is an intermediate stage in the plate making process, starting with a single master plate, which is used to make some of these intermediate plates. And then the intermediate plates are further used to make printing plates, actual production plates. All of these plates are made by electrolytic deposition, using an anode and a cathode in a huge tank with the metal in suspension in the liquid, and applying electricity across the expanse of the tank. You get metal deposited out on the far side as a direct copy of the original, which is depositing against. So this came off of the master plate in true image, and it's raw. It's not treated in any way after it comes out of that tank, and then it's used to make a production plate, which is reversed, which is true intaglio. This other one back here, everything was raised above the surface. This is called an alto plate. Everything is raised above the surface, just like letterpress. But the basso plate, which is intaglio, everything is inside into the surface, is the one that's actually produced from, and this has been chrome plated. That's why it looks so bright and shiny here, because before they put them on the press, they chrome plate them to increase the longevity of the plate. Now, how is that plate used? Well, here's a printing process. This is Mike Beck. He's a plate printer from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. All day long at the Bureau, he prints things like this, which are diplomas, award certificates for decorations, and other things that need intaglio printing or embossing. He doesn't work on the floor with the great big rotary presses that are printing paper money. He's working one sheet at a time, one plate at a time. This is a plate, and you can see how shiny this plate is, how well polished it is, because that's a reflection of his thumb. This right here is reflecting the thumb that's holding this, the hand that's holding this plate up. He's going to print a souvenir card from this plate. And you can see it's all in mirror image. National Money Show, Fort Worth, Texas, March 2010. This is 10 years ago. And he's using two colors. This part here and this text down here are going to be in black, and all of this is going to be in green. The one you buy from the Bureau is all in one color. So the one you buy from the Bureau at the show is in two colors. It was printed at the show. There he is applying black ink. He's already put the black ink on this part here, and he's applying black ink here. And then he's going to scrape off as much of that excess ink as he can with that same plastic applicator tool. There he's scraping away excess. And now he's going to wipe the surface of the plate to wipe away all the ink that's still sitting up on top of the plate and leave behind the ink down in the grooves and the letters. This is cheesecloth, a big wad of cheesecloth. And he's using that to wipe away as much as possible of the stray ink still out on the surface. Look at all the fingerprints here. Then he's going to use his bare hand to finish the wiping. Actually, we're not at that stage yet. He's done the preliminary wiping on the black. Now he's applying the green. Now he's wiping the green with the cheesecloth. And now he's using his bare hand. You've got all the obvious ink is gone from the surface of the plate, but he's using his bare hand with talc on it to remove the final stages of the ink that's on the non-printing surface of that plate. It's chalk on his hand, not talc. There's a reflection of the handle of the press that this is going to go into. Now this plate is ready for printing. He's taken all the ink. It looks like there's no ink on the plate at all, but there actually is ink in all of these engraved surfaces. They're full of ink, and there's no ink left out on the non-printing surface. That's what he's going to print on. Now this is pre-printed at the bureau, and then brought out. It's damp. They keep these things in a plastic bag with I don't know how much water they put in with them, but they're dampened so that they will pick up the ink a little better. They'll emboss into the grooves a little better. All of this is by offset lithography, printed by offset at the bureau before it comes out. And you can see that his name is going to go here, and the date is going to be over here. And over here underneath his thumb, there's a serial number, 1 through 100 for most conventions. They sell 100 of these souvenir cards printed at the convention for $50 a piece. Now here it's going through the press. It's on, the card is on the plate. The plate is engaged under this pressure roller and pushes out the other side. And the card actually pops off and sticks to the roller. And down here is what's left of the ink in the plate. There's the handle of another handle of the press. There's enough ink in here you could do another impression, but they don't. They re-ink it for every card. But there's the result coming out all perfectly aligned. Well, there's what he printed from, and that's what he printed to. And there's the entire plate with the finished card. Now, this is another aspect of modern notes. Since we went to the colorized notes, we have offset lithography in the fields of the finished note, the colorized note. This again is from the $20 bill. It says 20 USA, USA 20, and an eagle. And this is from the next note over here. So here's one note's worth of lithography or of offset. You're going to see here very quickly that it's not actually lithography. This is a huge sheet with 32 notes on it, and we're looking at just one corner of it. Now this is a photographic negative. It's transparent plastic, but black where you don't want light to pass through, and light where you do want light to pass through with a pattern. And that's going to be printed onto this surface. It's like photographic printing, except instead of paper, this is a very heavy-duty plastic in layers. When it's raw, it's all red. The entire thing is red. After the negative is placed on it and it's exposed to a very bright light, probably a carbon arc, the areas where the light passed through, the light areas that you just saw on the negative, pass through onto the surface of the red plastic, and then it goes through a development process. In the development process, the red which was exposed to light is left behind, and all of the rest of the red is eaten away. And you end up with a raised surface here, which is going to take ink. Well, what did we say that a raised surface to take ink is? It's letterpress. So this is actually not offset lithography, it's offset letterpress, which is a technique which is now being used by most security printers. But they're using this kind of a transfer process to put an image onto a printing surface, which is going to take ink. In this case, it's going to be colored ink. and it's going to be printed onto the white paper. And then the intaglio will be printed after that. Now there's what it looks like when it goes on the press. This happens to be the $100 sheet here. That's the design that's on $100 notes. And it goes on a rotary press, and then it actually bolts onto the rotary element of the press, and ready to go through and be inked, and then transfer that ink to banknote paper. Okay, what do I want next here? Watermarks. Where is my, here we go. All right. Nope, I'm in the wrong spot here. Sorry about that, folks. Let's back up a little. Okay, I need one image here. This is everybody seeing two folks here in a paper making process? You seeing that, Sam?
Yes, sir. Yep, got it on the screen there.
Okay. All right.
You may want to click where it says enable editing. It may just so that line goes away there. Maybe make it a little bit bigger.
No, this is a PDF document.
Oh, okay. All right, never mind then. Okay.
All right. This is a screen in a wooden frame, which is used for making paper in old time process. This is a, no, that's not what I want to do. This is a paper making mill from the 1930s making banknote paper. And you can see that they're making it one sheet at a time using a slurry of textile fibers in water on a screen. And then down here in the foreground is a big stack of single sheets that have come off of this screen or multiple screens. They're still very soft, very wet. They need to go through a drying process. But if there's a watermark in this screen, it's already applied at this stage. When the slurry is put on the initial screen, if you're going to have a watermark, that's where it's going to be. Now, I'm going to switch over to modern paper making. We're going to look at the paper mill at Langquart in Switzerland, which is where they make all the paper for Swiss francs. If I can find it here. Well, I don't see it. I have a video here. That's not it. My laptop screen is so small, it is very hard to read. I normally use a big monitor. Well, I apologize. I had that screen open. Yeah, it's still open. But I don't think we're gonna. Are you seeing a video screen here? Or what are you still seeing? You're still seeing my...
Not yet. I'm just seeing you right now, Joe. Yeah, not your screen.
Yeah, all right. All right, I need to go back to this. How banknote paper is made. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Now you got it?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I remember. Yes, there's that one video. Yeah, this is good.
All right,
Okay.
this is from the Lawn Quart paper mill, and this fellow is speaking with a Swiss accent, so I might stop at a couple of places and elaborate on what he's saying, and if I think maybe you didn't catch the words. Uh, we're at the stage at the mill where the cotton has come in from the field. This is raw cotton, which is going to be used to make banknote paper. They don't have any linen in the paper in the Swiss francs. So let's proceed with this.
So we are here at the cotton preparation system. We get our cotton combers, that's the raw material for the banknotes. We put the bales here, we stand them up, and then this cotton plucker, he sucks and takes away the cotton, sucks it to this cleaning station, and in the cleaning station we sort out plastics and metallics, so everything what should be not within the banknotes we sort here out. And wood material we put to the bleaching process in the next building. In this cotton bleaching system, we add here the caustic soda and the hydrogen peroxide as the bleaching chemicals. We cut also the fibers. We put it all in this long conveyor belt. And from this conveyor belt, we put the fibers into the next PV system. And there we cut again the fibers and we wash out the bleaching chemicals. We have here our raw material, the cotton combers, very dirty. We clean it in the system before. And after this bleaching process is finished, we have here a whiteness something about 89 to 90%. And we pump the solution about 4% consistency to the next chest. We are here at our brand new paper machine. We produce here the banknotes. So we add the fibers on the mold. We add there also the security thread for the banknotes. We press out the water and we dry the fibers and the paper. Then
Okay, you heard he said that they use a 12% slurry. So they got 12% cotton and the rest is water, and it goes across the screen. Now, what you're seeing here, this paper running through the mill has already been through the screen process. The paper already has enough consistency that it can actually be run through all these rotary devices. And he said that the security thread has already been inserted and the watermark has already been created. That all happened at the screening stage when it was still a slurry of cotton fibers mixed with water.
we size the paper so that it's printable, and then we dry it again and have a quality control at the end of the paper machine.
He said they size the paper. The sizing is a chemical process that puts a finish on the surface of the paper so that it will accept ink. If you think about dropping a drop of water on newsprint, which has no sizing, the water just immediately goes out in all directions, soaking into the paper. But if you drop a drop of water like that on high quality bond, it stays on the surface of the paper as a drop of water. It doesn't soak into the paper. And it's that kind of process which is used to prepare the paper for printing.
We use different molds to produce different watermarks. On these molds, there are the watermarks on. And for every batch, for every banknote production, we have to change this mold. And then we can start again. And then we have a new banknote. So we have here our control, a visual inspection for the paper makers, how they visually inspect the paper quality. We cannot film this more detailed for high security reasons. So in this building, we split the walls. We have one big mother wall, and we divide this big mother wall in 2 or 3 daughter walls. As you can see here, we have something about 100 tons of paper, what we go now to the cross cutter. You see here 2 different daughter wheels. From this daughter wheels,
Now these lines here are the security thread, which is already embedded into the paper. This is the same kind of thread that we have in a new $100 note, where you have a thread that's windowed in and out of the paper, and you can actually see elements moving in that thread as the thread is tilted back and forth.
We cut them in sheets. The paper will move in this way. First of all, we do an edge trim that we have the correct width of the paper. After that, we have an inkjet marking. On this inkjet marking, we put on every sheet an inkjet mark, because we have to have a traceability for every sheet. After that, we have a web inspection system where we control every sheet for holes, wrinkles, dirt, and so on. Behind, we have there the stacking of the reams. We put 500 sheets to one ream. We move them this way, and then we package, we embellage the reams. And when the reams are ready packaged, we go to the pallet. We palletize all the reams. We shrink the complete pallet and put it directly into the traceur. From this traceur, it goes per high security transport to our customer.
Okay, now I go to the watermarks. All right, this is one of the molds that he was talking about. He said that they have a different mold for every type of note that they're producing paper for. This is a mirror image. You can see that into this screen is impressed the letters LTN, which stand for legal tender note, the £1 sign, and a numeral 1. And this is Erin, E-R-I-N, one of the mythological representatives of Ireland. So this is a watermark for an Irish note back in the days when, well, a long story about what legal tender notes amount to in Ireland, but I won't go into that. This screen is attached to the big screen. So there's as many of these across the big screen as there are going to be banknotes across the width of the strip of paper that is being manufactured. And then down in columns, in rows, again, to make the repetitive design over and over. So that when the when the roll is then cut into individual sheets, you have as many repetitions of this watermark as there are going to be notes on that sheet. Here's one for the Reserve Bank of India, a 10 rupee note, RBI for Reserve Bank of India, and the Ashoka column, a three-faced column that's one of the representatives of the Republic of India. And here we have from Thai notes, the Constitution on a pedestal, which is used as a watermark in Thai notes. Now you can get, depending on whether the watermark is impressed into the screen or raised out of the screen, depending on which way the watermark is oriented when the paper is made, you can get a white watermark or a dark watermark or a mixed watermark. Here's a white watermark. This is the what we call the quatrefoil watermark, a four-lobed floral watermark in white on Japanese invasion money. In this case, when the slurry went onto the screen, the watermark element was raised above the surface of the screen so that the paper was a little bit thinner wherever that watermark appears, and it then appears white when you illuminate it from behind. Now here we have one which is a black watermark, a dark watermark. This watermark is usually very hard to see, and although this note is a rag, it's got the watermark very, very visible. Allied military authority. Military authority allied, repeating throughout the paper. Even if a note is in this condition, if it's the best version of the watermark that I've been able to find for a while, I keep it as a watermark reference. Here's a note that has a black and white watermark. The Japanese are past masters at making gorgeous watermarks. I never go past one of these notes in any dealer's stock without stopping to hold it up to the light and admire that watermark. It's just simply wonderful, with both black and white elements, because there was a very textured mold, similar to the one you saw for Aaron. Aaron's head is the same way, if I had an Irish note here to show you. Okay, now it's the 1 hour mark. Take 5 minutes. Come back in 5 minutes, and we'll continue with why do counterfeiters counterfeit?
Okay, that sounds fine, Joe. You want to take 5, and then when you come back, we've got 3 questions that people have asked. So,
all right. Well, go ahead and give me the questions.
Okay. All right. John P. asks, what is the printing process of the Treasury seal?
Oh, that's letterpress. Okay.
All right.
Remember when we showed that Treasury seal, it had the little edges, the little halos around the edges.
Okay. So the next question from Fabrizio R. is, which is the banknote that was used as the sample to illustrate the Silkscreen technology? He said, we could see letters B and I. Thanks.
Oh, well, that's a Djibouti. The overprint is the BI is Banque de l'Indochine, the Bank of Indochina. But the letterpress, the overprint was put on by the Free French forces fighting up through the Horn of Africa. It actually was called France Combattate, the Fighting French. In other parts of Africa, we had the Free French. They weren't calling themselves Français Combattate. I don't remember what they called themselves, but it was the Free French forces, and then the Fighting French were on the other side of Africa.
Okay. The last question we have here, Lauren B. asks, I think I know this one. I would like to know how accurate counterfeit pens are to detect counterfeit notes. How do the pens work?
Okay. All right. Let me. So the Treasury seal, the BI note, and pens. All right. I wouldn't normally get the pens, so I can address that. And for the other note, I'll look up the PIC number right now and on that one. Okay. It's PIC 13. No, not PIC 13. That's the antelope. Yeah, okay. It's PIC 13 alpha. 13 with a capital A.
All right, Joe. So do you want to take 5 then?
Well, I'm not going to take 5. I'll just go refill my water glass and
Sure, go right ahead.
come right back. But we got to give them 5, so we've got what, another 1 minute.
Yeah, thereabouts. But it is your presentation, sir. So whenever you're ready to continue.
Yeah, it's not nearly as simple as I'm just using my own screen. Well, the break's about over.
Joe, we have 2 more questions that came in. Actually, 3. I think another one just came in too.
Shoot.
All right. Next question here from Floyd A. It says, with all the steps in the paper making process, plate making process, and printing process, what kind of error notes can occur? Ooh, I don't know if we have time to answer that one in this forum.
Well, lots of errors. All right, what's the next one?
Manju A asks, has Joe captured this fantastic knowledge in any books? Just want to know if you've authored any works.
Well, not yet.
Okay. And the next question from Chris B. will be hitting me up for YN notes, I'm sure, pretty soon. How were Confederate notes produced? I'm guessing CSA notes.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and proceed right now.
Okay.
And I'll address these 6 questions quickly, and then we can get into the next slide, set of slides. So put me on the screen.
Oh, you should be okay. It's
I'm seeing you.
okay. If you hit share screen, it should go back to that, I believe.
No, I can't. I don't see me there anywhere. No.
All right, let me
Well, that's all right. We'll just go to the first
there it goes.
slide. That's the first slide for the next set of slides, and I'll just talk about the questions before we proceed. All right, we had some questions come in that were relayed to me during the break. This is the first slide in the next slide set, but I'll talk about these questions here briefly. How is the Treasury seal printed on U.S. notes? It's letterpress. It's always been letterpress. Remember when we showed the top of that one Treasury seal, it had the very fine dark lines across the top of it, across the tops of the spikes. On the banknote that said BI that I was showing the letterpress or the silkscreen counterfeit, that was French Somaliland pick 13 capital A. It's illustrated in the standard catalog as a 20 franc note, which is pick 12 capital A. It's that overprint. The BI is actually a BIC abbreviation for Banque de l'Indochine, the Bank of Indochina. Then the next question was, I can't read my writing here. What was, oh, about watermark or counterfeit pens, counterfeit detection pens. Remember we talked about sizing. We talked about the preparation of the surface of the paper to take ink. The sizing on standard bond is a starch-based sizing. The pen is an iodine pen. Iodine and starch react to turn black. When you put iodine on a starchy substance, you get a black reaction. The sizing used on US banknote paper is animal fat and glycerin. There's no starch in it. So the iodine pen does not react to the surface of the note because it can't reach any starch in the note because the sizing is blocking its access to the note. On a very, very worn note where the sizing could be, partially removed, you might get some intermittent black spots on a worn note. But I've gone all the way back into series 1934 on US notes using the pen, and it does not react. And in fact, after a couple of weeks, even the yellow disappears. You can't even see where the pen was applied to the paper. Then what kinds of errors can occur in all these miscellaneous steps in paper making, printing, and what have you? Well, there's no end. There's, entire books have been published on paper money errors. You can get, in the printing process, you can get the paper folded over, you can get the wrong paper, you can get the watermark put in upside down, the paper put in the press upside down. There's just all kinds of things that can happen in a mechanical press. In the paper making, the only obvious things I can think of is if a watermark mold is damaged or falls away from the screen so that the note doesn't get the watermark or no watermark appears in that section of the paper. Other kinds of errors could be discoloration, where something gets in the paper that's not supposed to be there, but that shouldn't get out of the mill. So you don't find very many paper errors except for using the wrong paper for a specific note. Have I written anything? Well, I'm working on a book right now on Operation Bernard. I'm only writing the technical chapter of it. There's going to be a comprehensive book that has many chapters, and I'm only writing a technical chapter and editing the entire book. But I do write a column every issue of Paper Money magazine, so if you belong to Society of Paper Money Collectors, I've got a long series of columns going back several years, all dealing with counterfeits. And how were Confederate notes printed? Confederate notes were printed mostly by lithography, some by letterpress, and some by intaglio. It depended on what printer was available that they could write a contract with. So some of the notes are high quality. Some of the notes were actually printed by American Banknote Company. Actually subcontracted out the National Banknote Company before the war started, but most of the Confederate notes are lithographed, and certainly the common ones are lithographed. Okay, let's proceed on here now with why do counterfeiters counterfeit? It's not always just to get over on your fellow man. Now, this first example is, in fact, one like that. This is a note. The one on top is genuine. It's intaglio. The one on the bottom is counterfeit. I believe it's letterpress. I don't remember at this point whether it's letterpress or lithograph, but probably letterpress. And it was intended to circulate. So it was intended to profit the person who made it. The back side is not nearly as good looking. You can see the back is much more washed out than the genuine. The genuine is a two-color, blue and black. And you got blue and black down here, but the black plate especially is not very well done. But most people don't bother to look at the back of a note anyway. So if you got a nice finish on the face, and all the colors are there, and you stick this bad note in a stack of these. If you're buying a 50 yuan item and you have one of these mixed in with 4 of these, it's going to go through. It'll be later that the teller discovers, or the clerk discovers, that the business is taking a counterfeit into the till. Now here's a case where this note was counterfeited by the Japanese. It wasn't, I don't know if you can call them counterfeits, because they were using all original plates, papers, inks, and presses. They captured the print plant during World War II. This is a nationalist Chinese note. It had value in international commerce. The Japanese said, well, let's just keep printing it and spend them in international trade, buy war material with them. But for some reason, they didn't want to leave the plant where it was near Hong Kong. They took the whole thing up to Tokyo, and it took a couple of years to get the thing up and running. By the time they were done, the value of a 10 yuan note was virtually meaningless, not to mention the fact that nationalists had taken steps to repudiate the notes that had been captured by the Japanese. So they really had very little use for these when they finally got them into the market. I haven't yet found a diagnostic that could separate the Japanese printed ones from the Chinese printed ones. Several years ago, this is the back of that note, several years ago, a whole flock of these things with rubber stamps appeared in the market. These are all printer's waste. There's some issue with the note or with some other note on the sheet before the sheet was separated. You can have stamps that say that the intaglio plate has a problem, or that the lithograph plate has a problem, or there's a third one. I don't remember what the issue was on the third one. It might have been a serial numbering, because for some of these, the serial numbers are mismatched. Not on this particular piece, but all of these are printer's waste, and I believe they stayed in Southeast Asia during the years after the war, and finally were recovered out of some warehouse someplace and put into the collector market. This was back in the 1970s or 80s. They've been around for a long time. But I don't think that there's any connection between these rubber stamped ones and the ones that the Japanese produced. Now here we have a case where the counterfeiting is being done by a government against another government, so that notes can be provided for fighters working behind the lines in the foreign field. So here we have the Japanese invasion money for Burma. This is the one from Malaya. And the British had troops in both Burma and Malaya fighting against the Japanese, actually organizing the locals against the Japanese. The numbers of troops, there might have been a dozen on the ground. They weren't enough to fight any kind of battle, but they could organize Burmese and Malay natives to fight the Japanese with them, and that's what they were out there for. But in order to finance that, they needed to have some of the Japanese invasion money. And they couldn't just go into a Japanese bank and make a withdrawal, and there weren't enough of them to go knock off a bank in a major city. So they asked to have these notes counterfeited and airdropped into them, and that's what was happening. The British counterfeited both of these in their Special Operations Executive, and we counterfeited both of them in the OSS, what did OSS? Office of Strategic Services. We also counterfeited Philippine Jim at MacArthur's request, and that was handled by the Army. In the US, the OSS was operated by the Navy. So the Navy and the Army were both counterfeiting notes using the same kind of paper, using Japanese invasion money paper that I showed you a watermark for earlier, and not talking to each other. There was no evidence in any of the files that we examined that the Army knew that the Navy was counterfeiting notes using the same paper. We have to assume that at some point the same printing operation was producing notes for both entities, for both branches of government. But as I said, nothing in the record indicates that there was any kind of coordination between the Army and the Navy in printing their different segments of these counterfeits. Now you look at the back of here, you can see that the notes look very similar, except for this scene in the middle of the Malay note, which is represented by the denomination in the Burmese note. Well, this is the one that we needed first. Our Team 101 in Burma needed these notes first. So these were done first. And then they went on to counterfeit these notes. And they stripped out the 10 rupees and inserted the design here, neglecting or maybe just ignoring the fact that the frames are in fact not identical. If you look right down in here in this area, in these frames, let's see what the next slide is here. Okay, this is what the Burmese note looks like. I'm sorry, this is what the Malay note looks like, the high arch under this element here. The Burmese note had the low arch. This is one of our counterfeits of a Malay note. They used the frame of the Burmese note, either not realizing or ignoring the fact that this was not the same in both notes. So we can identify our OSS counterfeits of these notes by this low arch in this element on the back of the Malay piece. There are very few of these notes in private hands. You know, they were pretty much used up during the war. Now in Thailand, the British had teams operating in Thailand the same way that we had them in Burma and Malaya. And they wanted the pre-war De La Rue printed Thai notes for financing their operations. These notes were never withdrawn during the war, and the Thais much preferred the pre-war notes to the notes that were being printed in Bangkok or were later printed in Indonesia and then brought up to Thailand. So the British team asked to have these reprinted by De La Rue. They went to the De La Rue company and said, we need you to reprint this note for us, actually 3 denominations. We want you to use existing serial numbers because they didn't want to have notes with a serial number that was never formally issued, because anybody caught with one of those numbers was going to be off with his head. So De La Rue said, go away, don't bother us. You're not our customer. The Thai government is our customer. So the British went away and confiscated for a while, and then they came back and confiscated the plates. And after they confiscated the plates, they handed them back to De La Rue and said, all right, now we're your customer, print the notes. So De La Rue printed the notes, but they modified the notes before they printed them, modified the plates, so that the Thai government could repudiate the counterfeits after the war if they wanted to. Now, this is a gross violation of operational security, because if you've got a modification in a plate that can be identified, then the note becomes worthless. In fact, it becomes a hazard to try to use it, because if you get caught with one of these in your hands, then it's off with your head. Back on the Malay pieces, when the British counterfeited the Malay piece, they had a little problem with the smoke on the ocean liner in that ocean scene. And the Japanese figured out that that, in fact, was not their product. And that note was very hard to use, to pass, because the Japanese had recognized it as an Allied counterfeit. Well, the same thing was liable to happen with the Thai notes, because the De La Rue modified the plates. Now, here's one of the De La Rue counterfeits. These are called the free Thai notes. The Thais call these the free Thai issues, 1, 5, and 10 baht, because the elements that were using these were called the free Thai and guerrillas. Now we're going to look at right up in here and over here and over here. On the genuine note, you've got a shading line that comes right up here to the corner, right over here. The shading line coming right up to the corner here with that little bump on it. On the counterfeit, the Delarue reprint, they took off the top line. The bump's still there, but the top line is missing. Over in the Bay Area here, you have a very narrow opening here between the shading line and the next character. And in the reprint, you have a very wide open bay there. This is a naked eye diagnostic. You don't need a magnifying glass to see this, which makes it a very hazardous change to have made in the notes. Fortunately, it appears that the Japanese never picked up on it. Up here, you've got a long line, a middle line, and a short line, Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. And on the reprint, Baby Bear has disappeared. And there's some other differences too. This element over here, and there's various other differences, but all of these notes have these diagnostics that Delarue deliberately introduced when they reprinted these notes, which make them, you know, they're great cherry picking opportunities among these, but it really was not a good idea for them to do that where the notes were going to be going. All right, here's a note which was counterfeited by we don't know whom. We've assigned it to the British. We know that the British counterfeited notes of this bank. We have documentations that say that the British counterfeited notes of the Central Reserve Bank of China. The Central Reserve Bank was a Japanese-sponsored bank in Shanghai after the Japanese captured Shanghai, captured North China. They already had Manchukuo, the Manchurian provinces, before the war started, before we got into the war. They occupied Manchukuo in 1932, and the shooting war in China started in 1937, 4 years before we got bombed. Well, this bank was instituted, first notes are dated 1940, issued in early 1941. This note is engraved, it's a high quality note. It originated life as a brown face with a brown back, and then the Japanese changed to a violet face with a violet back with the same plates. There's the back of it. Now, somebody counterfeited this note, and you can see that the counterfeit is really not all that great. The serial number is terrible. The note is not intaglio. The basic note is, and even worse, instead of having the violet back to go with the violet face, it's got a brown back and a violet face. This note actually never existed. There never was a violet face with a brown back. So the note's obviously a problem. Well, this wasn't meant for the perpetrator to spend. He wasn't trying to make it look great. He was trying to disrupt the economy by inserting notes which were problematic that would make people distrust handling any of these notes. You know, if this one's obviously bad, is the next one going to be bad too? Am I going to get in trouble if I get caught with one of these? As I say, we don't know who did this, but we've assigned it to the British. Now here's one that the US did the same thing. We counterfeited this intaglio note in lithography and added a propaganda tab to the side. When you cut this tab off, you got a pretty good copy of one of these notes that can be spent, especially if you're spending it as one mixed with 3 or 4 others. You know, you don't try to spend one of these one at a time where somebody can actually take a look at it, feel it, say, well, that doesn't feel right to me because it's all slick and shiny instead of being intaglio. But if you put it in a stack with several other notes, it goes into the cash register, and then later in the day, somebody pulls it out and feels it and says, oops, we've got a problem here. We dropped millions of these things on the North Vietnamese during the war. There was a major study done on exactly how big this tab should be so that the notes would scatter widely when they were dropped from high altitude. instead of falling in clumps and clusters. We wanted them we didn't care if they landed in the jungle. They were dropped over population areas, and if they spread over into unpopulated areas, well, sorry about that. Paper's cheap. As I said, we dropped millions of those things on the North Vietnamese. Now here's a case of another propaganda usage. This is a note that was in circulation in Iraq at the time of the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. This is an intaglio note. It was printed in Europe, in Switzerland. These were called the Swiss dinars. The first counterfeit of these, with a propaganda message on the back, was printed by the CIA, and it's a really ugly counterfeit. I mean, nobody's going to try to spend that. The object is just to make somebody pick it up and take a look at the back. But the Saudis said, no, we don't want anybody messing with the currency. You can't use those. Take them back. Take them home. And they got put away in storage and didn't come out until after the war. But after a while, we told the Saudis to get bent, and we counterfeited the note in a map printing plant in Schwetzingen, Germany, just a few miles from where I was working in Heidelberg. I knew these notes were being printed there. I never got my act together and went out there to see if I could talk my way into the facility to take a look at the operation. These had 5 different backs, 5 different propaganda messages. There was the only one that's in color, a cartoon of a Iraqi soldier supporting Saddam with some sort of a complaint out here, which is supposed to engender feelings of animosity towards Saddam. Now that note, this is our counterfeit. That's the original. You can see that our replica was a little bit smaller than the original. The replicas were so popular that they were counterfeited. So here we have a counterfeit of our note. Now the counterfeiter in this case went back to the original size. So the counterfeit is bigger than the original note that we created. So here's the first counterfeit of the counterfeit. And then somebody else counterfeited it again in the proper size with slightly different colorations. I mean, you can tell the difference between this one and ours at a glance if you've handled enough of them. So here's a case of our propaganda piece being so popular that 2 other people here in the States counterfeited it for sale to collectors or to gun show enthusiasts. Now, when's a good time to counterfeit paper? When there's a currency exchange, a currency reform going on. For 2 reasons. One, the new currency is not familiar with the population yet, so it might be possible to pass a low quality counterfeit of the new currency because the folks handling it don't know what it's supposed to look like. Or the second reason is because so much money is going through the banks during the currency reform process that it's easy to slip some counterfeits in among them. Well, here we have a case of this note was a wartime, late war, pre-surrender note in Japan. After the war, in 1946, a currency reform occurred and this note was demonetized. But there weren't enough 100-yen notes printed to satisfy the need. So these wartime notes were revalidated with this intaglio stamp up here in the corner. So the note had no value unless it had a stamp. So what are you going to do here? You're going to counterfeit the stamp and put it on the note that you're stuck with that doesn't have a stamp on it. So here we have a lithographed counterfeit of the intaglio stamp. The color you can see is wrong. The big overprint here says no value. That means the note itself has no value because it doesn't have a valid stamp on it. The note itself is in fact a genuine note, but now worthless. And these 3 little rubber stamps here say counterfeit. So they pertain to the stamp itself. The stamp is counterfeit, the note is not, but the note is worthless because the stamp is not valid. I've only seen 2 of these counterfeit stamps in the 100-yen denomination, meant for circulation at the period. I've seen modern laser counterfeits of the 10 yen stamp applied to notes for sale to collectors. They should be intaglio. If it's laser, you don't want it, or you want it as an oddity, but not as a genuine piece. I haven't seen anybody try to counterfeit the 200 or the 1,000 yen stamps yet, because those are very, very rare. And for one thing, hard to find an example of a stamp to copy. Here's a case of a government counterfeiting its own money. This is North Korea, 1947 series. These were in use during the Korean War. After the Korean War, they were demonetized. In the 1980s, the Korean government needed more hard currency to satisfy their opulent lifestyle while the citizens starved. And so they reprinted their own notes from the original plates and sold them out through Hong Kong to try to generate a foreign exchange. The original paper has a watermark in it. The new paper does not. The original paper is sort of a cream color. The new paper is stark white. So if you encounter one of these 1947 notes, I believe there's 7 denominations counting the fractionals, that's on unwatermarked paper in bright white, it's one of those reprints. You don't want it. Now this is on a light box, and the watermark is not real conspicuous. It's alternating dark and light triangles in the shape of pseudo stars. It gives you the impression of stars in the paper, black and white stars. And you can see down here, there's absolutely no hint of any kind of watermark at all in the genuine paper. Now this note was created in Manchukuo late in the war, when they could no longer get notes out of Japan because of our submarine blockade. It's intaglio. It's high quality. It's on watermark paper. The only difference between this and the Japanese produced version, there are two. One is the imprint. This is Manchu Imperial Printing Bureau instead of Japanese Cabinet Printing Bureau. And there's only one serial number. They apparently didn't have enough serial number machines to print 2 serials on these notes, so there's only one. The block is in italics. That block on the Japanese produced ones were straight up and down. This was a very rare note before China opened up. I paid over $600 for my first one. Counterfeits of this began to appear because these were unavailable. Now that China has opened up, a lot more of these have become available, and the price is now down in the $200 range for the original intaglio Manchukuo produced piece. The counterfeit is letterpress. In this case, the serial number has 2 problems. One is that the first 4 digits are fixed and only the last 2 digits change. So you only get from 00 to 99 with the last 2 digits, and these are always 5314. In this case, it was doubled. It's the only doubled one I've ever seen. But you can see immediately that the size is different between the fixed numerals and the rotating numerals. And it's not intaglio, and it doesn't have a variegated tint. You see, this is a tint that goes from this dull yellow green to pale blue, back to dull yellow green again. On the counterfeit, they didn't have that variegated press, so they had to put these lines in here and print these separately. So they printed, the one color over here, a different color here, and then the third color out here. So it looks, very bad. Well, that wasn't an issue. When people didn't know what the genuine one was supposed to look like, and knowing that this was produced in Manchukuo in 1945 at the end of the war, it was easy to pass this off as the best that could be done at the time by the people who had to do it. Very few people had ever seen the original intaglio production from Manchukuo, so it was easy to pass these counterfeits. So the counterfeits are out there. If you're collecting this series, look out for them. Also, the color on the back, in Manchukuo, they didn't have the brown that was being used on the Japanese notes. The faker used the brown that had been used on the Japanese produced notes, even though he was trying to make the note that was produced in Manchukuo. In Manchukuo, they used this light violet ink because they didn't have the color that matched the original production. You can see the quality difference here between the Manchukuo intaglio and the counterfeiters letterpress. Now here's a case of counterfeiting for tourists. These were used in British Oceania. The O represents Oceania. The shilling, of course, represents British currency. You had half shilling, 1 shilling, 10 shilling, and £1 notes in this series. This is the scarcest series of the Japanese invasion money. These were used on Guadalcanal. What did you have on Guadalcanal? You had American GIs, Marines and Army. What do GIs want? They want something to send home to Susie, a souvenir. So somebody created souvenirs of these for sale to GIs. Now, whether any of the souvenirs ever got out to Guadalcanal or anywhere in the field, in the islands where the combat was going on, we don't know. We've never seen a short snorter that indicated that one of these replicas ever made it out to the troops in the field. But there were lots of troops in Australia going back there for rest and refit, or coming in from the States and being organized to send out to the islands. There are plenty of GIs and British troops as well, and Australian troops who would want to have examples of the currency being used out there. So here's the replica that was done in Brisbane. This is a book seller who contracted with a printer to replicate these notes. He didn't have a 10 shilling to copy, so no 10 shillings were ever done. He did the half shilling, 1 shilling, and £1, and he marked them replica. He put the word replica right on the note. So he wasn't trying to hide anything. The Australian government didn't like the fact that he was replicating money. They couldn't find any law against it because it wasn't legal tender in Australia, and he wasn't representing it as being any kind of money. They finally invoked the paper rationing regulations against him, said the use of paper for this is not supporting the war effort. So they shut him down. They confiscated his plates, picked up all his stock. He sold quite a few of them before the feds got to him, but they shut down that operation. But other people did the same thing. They were replicating notes, and they were not marking them as replica. Notice the OC is in red, and here the OC is not. And this tint behind, this gray-green tint in the background, is completely missing on this replica. We don't know who did this replica. 1 shilling and £1 notes were replicated by other operators, unmarked. There's the back of this 1 shilling. No indication that it's anything other than an original note. Here's the original £1 with red blocks, and this pale blue guilloche over here, this 10-lobed guilloche. That's difficult to copy. They were copying these things using photographic processes, and this didn't photograph well. The guy who made the original replica, this is one of the Brisbane replicas, had to copy the guilloche from the back of the note, right here. He took this guilloche and moved it to the face in something close to the proper color. And this is the one that has the red replica on the back. Well, the other counterfeiters who did these did the same thing. They used that same replica, same reverse guilloche from the back of the note, a little bit closer to the proper shade here, very faint, and unmarked. There's the dull green version. There's the olive green version. There's the bright green version. There's 3 different colors of these and shades in between, and different plates. If you get the microscopic examination of these things, they weren't all from the same printer. They weren't all the same plate. Now here's one that at least got as far as the USO show, signed by Phyllis Brooks, Gary Cooper, and Una Merkel, all Hollywood stars, and a bunch of people that were probably either other GIs or people supporting the USO troop. I think this fellow Nathan Bronstein here probably was an administrator or an advanced guy with the group, because it's all signed in the same pen. So who he was, I've never been able to figure out who he was with respect to the USO shows, but he was not an actor. Now here's the one that doesn't have any colors on it at all, except the green. It's still using that goes from the back. So this copy was made from one of the replica copies. It wasn't made from an original. And this was used at a Marine Corps reunion long after the war. If you find one of these all in one shade of green, they're from that reunion. And here's the classic thing you find at every theme park, replicas of old-time money on fake parchment paper. You open the envelope that these are in and stick your nose in, and you get blown away by the ammonia that was used to create this discoloration in the paper. There's lots of these of all different kinds of original notes created just for tourists. Okay, so that's the end of why do counterfeiters counterfeit. Now let's talk about how they get around the security features of the genuine notes. Let me see if I can find what I want next. Here we go. All right, what's the best way to try to make a counterfeit? Well, here's the original piece. This was a this one was lithographed. This is the second series Bradbury's Treasury Notes, 1914. This is World War I emergency currency in Britain. The first series were letterpress. The second series and subsequent were lithographed. This is the counterfeit. Look at how ugly some of this is. This is pen and ink. This is hand drawn. He did a great job with the Bradbury with the signature. We go back here and compare his signature with the original signature. That's very good work. Everything else is a little bit shaky. But pen and ink is the original way to create counterfeits of notes. You're not trying to get around anything that the original guys did, except with your own skill and imagination. And of course, the serial number here is very poorly done. You'd think he could have done that a little bit nicer. All right, let's advance here. Well, my system is getting clogged up. All right, you've come too many fun. All right, here's the next way that you get around note. You raise the denomination of a note. There we go. This is where I wanted to start. 2,000 yuan, 5,000 yuan, circulating simultaneously in China in 1946, 1947. This one's dated 47. This one's dated 45, actually. So, other than the denomination counters, there's no difference, and the color, of course, there's no difference between these two notes. So if you can change these 2s to 5s and get people to ignore the fact that there's a color difference. There were so many notes, so many different kinds of notes circulating in China right after the war, that if this was credible, nobody was going to pay much attention to what color the note was. Well, he did a very good job with removing the two counters. You can see here where he scraped away the two that was behind, and then re-inked, actually applied the 5, the character 5 first, and then re-inked all around it to simulate the lathe work here. Then he painted this white and painted these white as well to make them all stand out similar to each other. Also to cover up the work that, you know, the damage to the note behind where he had scraped off the old lettering. And he did that all the way around. He did that on all 4 corners. So he's got new counters painted in, and you can see the damage behind, but it's inconspicuous. It's just not very noticeable. On the back side, he changed the counter here. Now, he didn't do a very good job with the ones in the corners, but his audience wasn't going to be reading the ones in the corners. You know, his audience was going to be reading the Chinese, and the only place on the back where there's any Chinese is this counter right here. So he did a reasonably good job of that. There's another case of raising a note. This is a Bank of Communications. The Shanghai 1 yuan note was violet. In other cities, the 1 yuan note was other colors. If he could get some violet, you know, find a violet note that had counters that said 5 and cut them off and apply them to the ones, then he could change this to a 5 yuan note. And that's what he did with this. These are intaglio counters, and the paper is thinned. He took off the old counter, thinned the paper here, thinned the new counter that he was going to glue on there, and applied it. And you can actually see the character 5 underneath there. While this note was in circulation, some of the ink, you know, soaked through there and actually discolored the bare paper underneath that he'd skinned away. He changed all the counters. There's 2 counters here, 4 out in the corners, 2 big ones here. Changed all of those counters to 5s and did the same thing on the back. It would take several of the notes that he was, you know, working from to, you know, to, if you cut up a violet 5 from some other city too badly, you can't redeem it anymore. But if you only cut little bits and pieces off of several of them, they're all still good, and the counters that you've harvested from them can be used back in Shanghai. So, and this counter down here fell off as well. So at some point, enough counters fell off of this note that the jig was up and it went out of circulation. But this was a very sophisticated raising of this note. Now, another way that you can raise a note is to take the front and the back off of a note, take the front and the back off of a 20, glue mismatched pairs together, and always pass it with the 20 side up. So with 2 20s, you end up with $40 where you had $21 to start with. Now here you can see that this note, this is very thin here. It's actually gone through a couple of places. Here's that same piece, and the one up above was actually much thicker. The fellow who separated this, who happened to be my brother, only got about 1/3 of the note off the back and left 2/3 behind at the face. So unless you did the same with the 20, you got 1/3 of the face of the 20 and 2/3 of the back of the 20, the notes would feel too flimsy or too thick. But the object was just to see if he could split the note. You wet it, lay it down on glass so that the surface tension holds it down on the glass, and then you attack it with a razor blade from one side and just keep going across until you've separated the piece. Now, another way to counterfeit is to take genuine notes that you've stolen that aren't finished and finish them yourself. Put on your own serial numbers, put on your own signatures. These notes were coming out of Indonesia up to Thailand and were intercepted along the way, then finished with false signatures and false serials. And you see these are the same serial number. Now, this shouldn't have been a 5-digit serial number. These notes, when they were issued in Thailand, the lithograph notes had 6-digit serial numbers. This counterfeiter apparently didn't realize that, so he was putting on the 5-digit numbers that were on the original Intaglio notes. And these two counterfeiters, one of them used a 6-digit number properly, the other one used a 7-digit number. These are both fake notes printed on those same stolen, unfinished notes with false signatures and false serial numbers. Once that happened, the Thais didn't issue any more of them. They put them in storage, and then after the war, they overprinted them for 50 satang, half of a baht, as an emergency issue during the immediate post-war recovery period, Series 7A of the Thai series of notes. Now here's a case where the counterfeiter went back to the original printer. This is Alves Reyes, the man who stole Portugal. He went back to Waterloo and said, we lost some of these things in a flood. We need you to reproduce them for us using the same serial numbers, so we don't need to juggle our books and reaccount for the serial numbers. And showed all kinds of documentation showing he was in fact a representative of the finance ministry. And Waterloo bought it. They printed the notes for him. Some of them you can separate because in the process, some of the plates wore out, and Waterloo introduced new plates, and the plates have serial letters on them that you can identify. But some of the ones that use the original plates from the first printing are very difficult to try to separate. And this scam was still going on later, after, decades later. This Bahrani note was reprinted by an Argentine security printer by a scam team that came to him with false credentials and talked him into reprinting the note from whole cloth. They weren't the original printers. They didn't have the original plates. They had to replicate the note from scratch, which they did. And there's one distinction. The serial number has a gap here between the block letters, and that's the fake note. And that was picked up on eventually, and now it's well recognized. And we're out of time. We've used up our 2 hours. There's quite a few more slides in this set, but if you want to see the rest of them, come take my class. Sam, we have any further questions I can answer quite briefly?
Yeah, we have time. We can do a couple. If we don't have a ton of time left, but we can actually do some. The rest of them, Brianna will probably email to you, so you'll be able to respond to people that way. But we do have one question from Kevin L. It says, what were the smallest and largest pieces of paper money produced on a large scale by any country?
Smallest and largest. Well, I've got counterfeit.
Quantity.
Oh, quantity.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. That could be taken 2 ways, Kevin.
Well, if you're talking about hand drawing notes, the smallest quantity could be 1. I don't know if any hand drawn note only exists as 1. Even that 10 shilling note that I showed you, I got more than 1 from that same artist. Nice. Which came to me years apart. You collect these things long enough, people know what you're looking for, and they'll pass it on to you. And the largest quantity was probably Operation Bernhard in Germany, when the Germans were counterfeiting the British notes. And I was going to get to those shortly. In fact, there were probably 2 or 3 more notes further than we got. But
those are good. Yeah, no, that's hang on for a seminar. Yeah,
but in terms of denomination, I have counterfeited cent denominated notes from Hong Kong. don't remember if I've got a 1 cent, but I know I've got a 10 cent counterfeited note. And let's see, US fractionals, I don't think I've got anything below 50 cents in
Okay.
US fractionals.
He clarified. He meant in terms of size of the note. So just the physical size of the note.
Well, the Bernard were probably the largest physical size, but they weren't all that difficult because they were single color letterpress. Not nearly as difficult to counterfeit as multicolored notes today.
So another question: how were the U.S. counterfeit super notes created? Which governments did actually print those super notes, and are they still in circulation?
Well, they're still circulating, yes, because they're very good copies. The first ones came out of the Middle East, but were they created in the Middle East? I don't know, and I don't have access to Secret Service files on these things. I do know that North Korea is now well documented to have created at least the second and third generations of supernotes. Whether they were involved in the first generation or not, I don't know. But they laundered them through, the Korean ones were laundered through Europe and the Middle East. I have supernotes, let's say they're intaglio productions. That have Cyrillic cancellation markings on them that came out from behind the old Iron Curtain. But where they were created, I can't say. I don't know.
All right. One other question here: are U.S. banknotes still commonly forged? If so, what denominations are typically forged? And thanks, Joe. Love the presentation from Shauna S.
Well, they're still commonly forged. Peru is now the world center for lithograph notes, and they're putting the threads in the paper. They're making very, very good counterfeits, but they are lithographed. They're not intaglio. Counterfeit hundreds were still being created up to the time that we switched to the colorized 100. I don't know if the colorized, well, I've seen counterfeits of the colorized hundreds, but they're just inkjet copies done on a desktop printer. Those really don't count because they're very amateurish and very easy to detect. The most commonly counterfeited denomination for domestic use is the $20 bill, but for foreign use is the $100 bill. And most U.S. hundreds are overseas; they're not in the U.S. So all they have to do overseas is pass by somebody who doesn't recognize what a genuine note should look and feel like.
Nice. Well, Joe, yeah, folks, we're out of time. Brianna will be able to email you the rest of the questions, but just wanted to thank you very much for your presentation today, Joe. Folks, I will now be launching a survey for you to fill out. Please stay with us. It would really help us. Please complete this survey before you leave the presentation. We'd appreciate it. The survey is multiple choice. I hope you choose to take it. If you need to elaborate on one of your answers or have additional comments, please email them to Brianna Victor at seminars@money.org. I want to thank you, Joe, for your time today. Really appreciate you doing your presentation. And we have a certificate of appreciation that we will be sending to you. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this presentation today. Please join us for our next presentation of the ANA's eLearning Academy. The presentation is called When the Die is Wrong. Wrong die varieties that can be found and collected by my buddy, John H. Miller Jr. And that is going to be on Tuesday, the 28th of this month. So please tune in for that. It's going to be starting at noon Mountain Time, the way this presentation did. So without further delay, we'll see if we can get that poll started. And thank you very much, everyone, again, to tuning in today. Really appreciate your time. Joe, thanks again. And folks, have a rest of the good day, and please stay safe and careful and healthy. Bye, everyone.